Hello everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff, so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. The history of the cosmos is rarely shaped by grand wars or dying stars. Sometimes, it pivots on a single signature, penned in liquid ink, by a species deemed too dangerous to roam the stars. The galaxy thought they were locking the monsters in the basement. They did not realize they had just handed the monsters the keys to the foundation of reality itself. The hexagonal hall of the Galactic Synod was designed to diminish anything that stood within its center. Its towering walls were carved from a seamless, frigid material, resembling obsidian ice, pulsating with veins of pale blue bioluminescence that cast long, cold shadows across the floor. High above, arranged in perfect geometric symmetry that defied nature, sat the high representatives of the galaxy. They were the architects of the linear age, a coalition of superior species who lived by absolute predictability. To them, physics was a rigid religion, a set of unbreakable laws that ensured safety and order. The universe, in their eyes, was a clockwork mechanism, and they were its divine caretakers. In the exact center of the vast, echoing floor, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the alien architecture, stood Drew Brown. Earth's chief engineer and sole diplomatic representative wore a simple, sharply tailored charcoal suit. His hands rested easily at his sides. He stood completely alone before a judgment podium forged of solid, searing hard light, facing the scrutiny of 1,000 worlds. The air around him was heavy, suffocatingly dense with the gravity of centuries of strict diplomatic protocol. There was no breeze, no warmth, only the crushing weight of an empire looking down upon a lesser being. With a sharp, fluid gesture from the High Arbiter, the space directly above the hard light podium erupted into a flurry of massive holographic projections. They were not images of territorial disputes or border wars, but something the Synod considered far more profane. The projections showed complex equations, three-dimensional stellar maps, and terrifying, jagged fissures of purple energy ripping through the blackness of space. "You are accused of being reality breakers," the High Arbiter intoned. His voice was a synthesized drone that vibrated violently through the floorboards, designed to instill terror. "Your species insists on tampering with forces utterly beyond your primitive comprehension. The quantum core technology you are actively testing within your sector is an abomination to the natural order. Our deep space sensors have detected the spatial microfractures radiating from your test sites. You are risking permanent tears in the fabric of space-time itself. Your reckless, childish curiosity threatens the structural stability of the entire galactic arm." Drew watched the holograms of tearing space cycle above him, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He merely waited with an eerie, profound stillness. The High Arbiter leaned forward, his form a towering silhouette of dark chitin and absolute judgment. "The verdict of the Synod is unanimous and final. Earth is hereby permanently struck from the registry of potential galactic members. Furthermore, by the power vested in this Supreme Council, your species is absolutely forbidden from accessing the hyperlanes. You are permanently quarantined within your own solar system. The decree is absolute. Any vessel bearing human origin that crosses the threshold of the Kuiper Belt will be fired upon and obliterated without warning, without communication, and without mercy." A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the hexagonal hall. The alien representatives leaned forward in their elevated, glowing seats. Their multifaceted eyes, thermal sensors, and auditory organs locked onto the solitary human. They knew the dark, violent history of humanity. They had studied the bloody, desperate rise of the apes from dirt to the stars. They expected a breakdown. They anticipated desperate begging, tearful pleas for mercy, or, more likely, a volatile explosion of primal, aggressive rage. In the deep shadows flanking the room, heavily armored guards shifted their energy weapons, fully prepared to physically subdue the savage diplomat the exact moment he snapped. The tension stretched, thick enough to choke on, and then something entirely unsettling happened. Drew Brown smiled. It was not a manic grin, nor was it a sneer of bitter defiance. It was a soft, almost relieved smile. It was the distinct expression of a man who realized a long, incredibly tedious meeting had finally reached its conclusion. Slowly, deliberately, Drew reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. The guards tensed, their weapons humming to life with a high-pitched whine. But he only withdrew a slender, antique fountain pen. It was a relic of old Earth, crafted from polished silver and filled with actual, physical liquid ink, a quiet testament to a species that still cherished the tangible weight of their history. A digital document materialized on the hard light podium, glowing with restrictive crimson runes and the imposing seal of the Synod. It was the Treaty of Isolation. It was the absolute death warrant for human expansion. Drew unscrewed the cap of his silver pen. He leaned over the blinding light of the podium and, with smooth, elegant strokes, signed his name. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The liquid ink hissed faintly as it bound with the hard light interface, permanently locking the treaty into galactic law. He capped the pen, slid it back into his pocket, and casually adjusted his cuffs. The collective confusion of the Synod hung in the air like a physical weight. The High Arbiter remained entirely frozen, completely unsure how to process this baffling lack of resistance. Drew took a half-step back from the podium and offered a polite, shallow bow to the towering figures looking down at him. "Thank you," Drew said, his voice carrying clearly and calmly across the vast, silent hall. "To be honest, having to abide by your boring laws of physics was holding us back. The solar system is plenty wide enough for what we are about to do." Without waiting to be dismissed, the chief engineer turned his back on the supreme rulers of the galaxy. His footsteps echoed with sharp, rhythmic precision against the obsidian floor as he walked away, leaving the highest court in the universe completely paralyzed by the terrifying weight of his calm. Drew Brown's shuttle hit the atmosphere like a thrown stone. He stepped onto the tarmac into a storm of blinding camera flashes, harsh neon rain, and frantic shouting. The global markets were in freefall. Planetary defense grids were locked on maximum alert. Politicians sweated through their expensive suits on live broadcasts, screaming about the end of the world. The interstellar trade lanes were dead. The human race had been boxed in, locked away, and effectively sentenced to a slow, suffocating economic death. Drew did not go to his office. He walked straight into the brutalist underground bunker of the United Earth Command, plugged a heavily encrypted drive into the central mainframe, and hit execute. The frantic red alert screens across the globe flickered and instantly changed. The panic feeds were overwritten by cascading lines of impossible mathematics, rotating geometric models, and a single, glowing title that bathed the room in stark white light: Project Mobius. "We are no longer building ships to go out," Drew announced to the stunned assembly of global leaders, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "We are going inward." For years, his engineering teams had been working in the dark, hidden deep beneath the ice of Europa and the dust of Mars. They had theorized physics so violently unstable that even whispering the equations would have gotten them glassed from orbit by the Galactic Synod. Now, the leash was completely off. The adults had left the room, and the children had the entire laboratory to themselves. Project Mobius was not about faster-than-light travel. It was about spatial compression. It was about folding space. It treated the fabric of the solar system not as a static empty void, but as a sheet of theoretical origami paper, free from the oppressive, highly conservative safety laws of the Alien Council. Human scientists descended upon anomalous physics like starving wolves. They threw out the linear textbooks. They began mapping the invisible fault lines of reality itself, eager to pry them open. The societal shift was violently sudden. It was a complete 180-degree turn in global consciousness. Humanity did not weep for the lost stars. When faced with absolute imprisonment, the collective human mind simply adapted with terrifying speed. The horrifying quarantine morphed overnight into a bizarre, heavily industrialized cosmic winter vacation. We were grounded, so we decided to build the ultimate, physics-defying fort. The global digital network exploded. Fear dissolved into chaotic, irreverent humor. One quote trended across every single platform, echoing the defiant sentiment of billions of people. "They banned us from the highway, great. We will just build a magic basement right under our house." The global economy restructured in a matter of days. The massive interstellar military budgets, amounting to trillions of dollars, were slashed to absolutely zero. The diplomatic corps dissolved. Every single cent of planetary funding, a staggering 100% of global wealth and resources, was aggressively funneled directly into interdimensional engineering. Shipyards that once built heavily armored dreadnoughts were gutted. They were retrofitted with terrifying speed to construct gravity compressors, dark matter engines, and spatial looms. Then came the testing phase. It was brutal, drenched in cold sweat, and spectacularly dangerous. Out in the freezing void near Jupiter, human engineering teams began doing things that would give any alien physicist a lethal heart attack. They constructed colossal, jagged orbital rigs the size of small moons. They used these massive metal beasts to intentionally detonate micro-quantum singularities. They were deliberately ripping violent holes in the fabric of space-time. From the outside, it looked like pure, unadulterated suicide. The gravity wells around the gas giant shrieked. Invisible shockwaves of exotic matter rippled through the asteroid belt, shattering millions of rocks and bending the light of the sun. But humanity was not destroying space. They were hollowing it out. They were capturing the violent, chaotic energy of the singularities and using it to inflate pocket dimensions. These were vast, artificial bubbles of reality, tucked safely and invisibly behind the main curtain of the normal universe. They built one, then they built 10, then they built tens of thousands. As the decades burned away in a fever of industrial progress, the outward face of the solar system began to change, but it did not look like progress to the rest of the galaxy. Far beyond the Kuiper Belt, alien observation outposts kept their cold, mechanical eyes fixed firmly on the human prison. They watched for the inevitable civil war. They waited for the final flash of nuclear fire that would signal the end of the violent apes. Instead, they saw something far more chilling. They saw nothing at all. One by one, the bright, noisy radio signals of Earth began to fade into static. The thermal blooms of orbital factories flickered and died out. The massive energy signatures around Jupiter sparked violently, flared in terrifying purple bursts of illegal physics, and then vanished completely into the dark. The space around the yellow sun grew cold, entirely dark, and utterly silent. To the linear, predictable minds of the Galactic Synod, the conclusion was obvious and entirely expected. The reckless humans had finally pushed too far. They had played with the forbidden fire of quantum mechanics and burned their entire system to ash. The monsters in the basement had finally suffocated on their own blind ambition. The galaxy officially marked the human race as extinct, closed the thick file, and looked away. They had absolutely no idea that humanity was not dead. Humanity had simply closed the door, locked it from the inside, and turned off the porch light. Nearly 100 standard years bled away into the silent void. To the universe at large, a single century is less than a fleeting thought. But for the empire of the Galactic Synod, it marked the quiet, agonizing onset of terminal decay. The sprawling alien coalition had stopped looking forward. Their absolute religious reliance on the established hyperlanes had bred a fatal complacency. When a civilization treats the fundamental laws of linear physics as a sacred text that must never be questioned, true innovation withers and dies. They continued to construct grander orbital palaces and more heavily armed cruisers, but the core engineering driving their empire remained entirely identical to the blueprints used a millennium prior. They had perfected their safe, predictable existence so thoroughly that they had completely forgotten how to survive the unpredictable forces of the wild cosmos. Then, the outer edge of their pristine galaxy began to simply cease to exist. It did not announce itself with a spectacular supernova or a declaration of conquest from a rival empire. It manifested as a subtle, creeping darkness in the deepest outer spiral arm, a ravenous shadow that actively consumed the radiant light of distant star clusters. The terrified Synod astronomers quickly designated the anomaly as the null wave. It was a cosmic storm of completely unfathomable proportions, a tidal wave of turbulent dark energy that did not just crush physical matter, but aggressively unraveled the very fabric of space and time. It rolled through the void with absolute silence, swallowing entire constellations. Plentiful agricultural planets and heavily fortified military outposts were not physically shattered by the phenomenon. They were simply erased from existence, deleted from reality as the wave tore the dimensional tapestry completely apart. In a desperate bid for survival, the Galactic Defense Force mobilized the greatest armada the universe had ever witnessed. Billions of highly disciplined alien soldiers and millions of heavily armored dreadnoughts formed an impenetrable blockade across the stellar drift. They activated their overlapping planetary energy shields and charged their colossal laser batteries, determined to hold the line against the encroaching dark. It was a breathtaking, cinematic display of linear military might. And it was completely useless. The precise moment the heavily shielded Vanguard ships touched the leading edge of the null wave, their advanced technology fundamentally failed. The unbreakable hard light barriers snapped like brittle glass under a heavy boot. Directed energy weapons dispersed instantly into harmless, scattered static. The massive, kilometers-long hulls of the dreadnoughts fragmented instantly, crushed not by any physical impact, but by the absolute collapse of quantum probability around them. The rigid, linear physics they worshipped offered absolutely zero defense against a fundamental quantum anomaly. The grandest armada in galactic history was reduced to subatomic dust in less than a terrifying minute. Panic, pure and primitive, finally consumed the once arrogant empire. Far away, isolated in a forgotten corner of the Orion Arm, the solar system lay veiled in what the aliens perceived as absolute darkness. But the silence was a brilliant, highly engineered illusion. If a desperate galactic observer could have peeled back the visual spectrum and looked through a multi-dimensional lens, they would have been blinded by the sheer, imposing majesty of human architecture. The space surrounding Earth and its neighboring planets was no longer a simple, empty vacuum. It was an intricate, breathing network of colossal geometric shapes glowing with fierce, golden light. Vast fractal megastructures, boasting surface areas larger than several terrestrial continents combined, spiraled out in impossible, mind-bending angles. Humanity had not just built hidden bunkers in the dark. They had woven entire, thriving cityscapes directly into the hidden folds of space-time, existing comfortably just underneath the skin of the normal universe. The entire solar system was a breathtaking masterpiece of interdimensional engineering, humming with the quiet, endless power of a species that had fully conquered the quantum realm. Hovering directly within the furious, swirling heart of Saturn's northern aurora, a sleek observation station remained perfectly anchored against the raging magnetic winds. Inside the panoramic command deck, Drew Brown stood with his hands resting casually inside his pockets. He was well over 130 years old, yet he possessed the physical vitality and sharp posture of a man in his prime. A casual, everyday byproduct of perfected human cellular regeneration therapy. His sharp eyes watched the mesmerizing dance of the gas giant below, an ancient planet now illuminated by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the human-made energy collection grid. Vast, invisible currents of captured dark matter flowed flawlessly along spatial tethers, feeding boundless power into the countless pocket dimensions hidden throughout the system. He held a simple ceramic mug, allowing the rich scent of dark roast coffee to ground him amidst the terrifying scale of human achievement. Deep inside the central console of the station, the primary environmental sensors chimed with a soft, gentle melodic tone. The deep space array had successfully detected the massive distortion violently sweeping through the galactic arm. The null wave was rapidly accelerating, heading directly toward the exact coordinates of the human quarantine zone. In the distant hexagonal hall, this exact same telemetry data was currently causing supreme alien leaders to wail in despair and watch their legacy crumble. Here, within the quiet sanctuary of Saturn, there were no screaming sirens. There were no flashing red lights indicating imminent doom. Instead, the main holographic display bathed the command room in a soothing, pleasant blue hue as a simple, incredibly mundane notification scrolled across the primary screen. Drew took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee and smiled warmly as he read the glowing text. Weather forecast: energy monsoon, preparing for landfall, requesting all collection stations to prepare for pocket dimension expansion. The null wave did not merely approach the glorious core worlds of the Galactic Synod. It consumed them with the terrifying, inevitable apathy of a cosmic predator. The sprawling jewel of the alien capital, a magnificent planet composed entirely of floating crystalline spires and harmonious light bridges, was now bathed in the sickly, suffocating shadow of absolute erasure. Trillions of voices screamed into the void, their cries utterly ignored as the fundamental fabric of their reality dissolved into chaotic dark energy. Deep within the deepest, most heavily fortified bunker of the Synod Command, the remaining High Council members stared at their failing strategic displays in pure, unadulterated terror. Their master cartographers, trembling with disbelief, noticed something entirely baffling. The wave was not expanding outward in an even, predictable sphere. It was rushing, accelerating like violent waters, draining into a colossal cosmic sink. The epicenter of that impossible gravitational pull, the absolute lowest point of dimensional pressure, was an isolated, forbidden patch of dead space. The quarantine zone, the solar system. Desperation bred an unbearable, bitter humiliation. Commander Zarn, a highly decorated veteran of the linear fleet and a staunch believer in alien supremacy, stood frozen on the bridge of the last functioning stealth scout vessel. Over 100 years ago, he had been a junior security officer standing guard in the hexagonal hall. He vividly remembered the pathetic, frail human engineer who merely smiled while signing his entire species away to rot in the dark. Zarn had felt nothing but absolute, self-righteous contempt for those aggressive apes. Now, his pristine, heavily metalled uniform was soaked in cold, terrified sweat. The dying Synod had handed him a suicide mission. He was explicitly ordered to fly directly into the eye of the raging storm, toward the human quarantine zone. His objective was a desperate, pathetic grasp at survival. He needed to scan the supposedly dead human worlds for any residual mathematical data that might explain the anomaly, or, if a miracle existed, find a single safe place to hide before the wave annihilated them all. Zarn's stealth ship pierced the invisible, heavily restricted boundary of the Kuiper Belt. He braced his four-armed body against the primary command console. He fully expected to find a silent graveyard of shattered rocks and the frozen, irradiated husks of human planets. Instead, the bridge of his ship plunged into a terrifying, suffocating blindness. The highly advanced sensor arrays, capable of mapping a single grain of sand from a light year away, returned absolutely nothing. The navigational screens displayed a chaotic, swirling sea of gray static. The helmsman shrieked in absolute panic, his digits bleeding as he frantically punched the failing console. According to the foundational, unbreakable laws of astrophysics, massive celestial bodies generated predictable, undeniable gravitational signatures. But there was no pull. There was no orbital resonance. Mars was gone. Jupiter, the colossal gas giant, had completely vanished. Even the yellow star itself cast zero thermal bloom on their monitors. The entire solar system had been completely erased from the physical plane. Zarn felt his twin hearts pound violently against his ribs. The sheer cosmic horror of the situation paralyzed his brilliant mind. They had flown directly into an absolute void, a terrifying pocket of absolute nothingness, where reality simply ceased to exist. Then, the empty space around them violently shattered. It did not break like glass. It tore like wet paper. A screaming fissure of dark purple energy ripped open directly off the port bow of the scout ship. Zarn was thrown violently to the metallic deck. The vessel was instantly caught in an uncharted, chaotic gravity storm. Invisible tidal waves of crushing spatial pressure slammed into the sleek hull. The linear physics engines choked, sputtered, and completely stalled, entirely unable to process the wildly fluctuating dimensional variables. Searing hot sparks showered down from the ceiling as the primary life support and safety systems caught fire, filling the enclosed bridge with the acrid, choking stench of melting circuits and burning ozone. The temperature on the bridge plummeted, thick frost rapidly forming over the cracked monitors. The hull groaned, emitting a high-pitched, agonizing scream of stressed metal preparing to implode. Zarn squeezed his primary and secondary eyes shut. His supreme, highly evolved biology offered zero comfort. His vast, centuries-old intellect was entirely useless. He was going to die in the dark, crushed like an insignificant insect in a cage built by inferior beings. A sudden, massive shadow completely blotted out the blinding purple light of the dimensional tear. Zarn opened his eyes, gasping for thin air as the violent shaking of his ship momentarily stabilized. Outside the primary viewing port, defying every single law of physics ever recorded by the Galactic Empire, a vessel approached. It was not a sleek, aerodynamic masterpiece of glowing energy and hard light. It was a brutal, wedge-shaped monstrosity of scarred, dark metal and exposed industrial piping. Its hull was violently scraped and dented from countless impacts, sporting massive, brightly painted renditions of the Earth flag. Underneath the flag, written in bold, jagged English letters, were mocking, satirical slogans praising the invincible human spirit and openly insulting alien speed limits. The human ship possessed no visible plasma exhaust engines. It was not fighting the impossible gravity storm. It was actively surfing it. The ugly metal wedge slid effortlessly along the razor-sharp crests of the chaotic spatial waves, using the terrifying, ship-crushing gravity shears as a frictionless highway. It maneuvered with a reckless, sickening agility that made Zarn highly nauseous just to observe. It danced through the fatal cosmic tear with the casual grace of a predator entirely in its element. Before Zarn could even begin to process the sheer, mind-breaking impossibility of the sight, the communication console on his burning bridge crackled violently to life. The audio feed bypassed his complex, military-grade decryption software entirely, slicing through the heavy background static with brutal, terrifying simplicity. A burst of rhythmic, ancient human guitar music blasted for a split second before being cut off. A voice echoed loudly through the smoke-filled bridge. It was not the booming, authoritative command of a superior galactic species. It was the completely relaxed, incredibly lazy drawl of a human being who sounded like they were mildly annoyed at being interrupted in the middle of a lunch break. "This is Earth Space Rescue Team Route 66. You are parked in the wrong lane during storm harvest season. Hold your position. We will hook a cable and tow you into port." A massive kinetic tow cable, glowing with raw, crackling gravitational tension, slammed violently into the battered hull of Zarn's dying scout ship. There was a jarring, bone-rattling lurch. The ugly, fiercely scarred human wedge ship engaged its spatial drive. It did not thrust forward using conventional propulsion. Instead, it forcefully grabbed the fabric of reality and pulled the universe backward over itself. They did not fly through the storm. They fell cleanly into an engineered tear in the cosmos. Zarn gripped the burning console as his vision completely inverted. The standard colors of the visible spectrum bled into terrifying, impossible shades of hyperviolet and deep infrared. The spatial fold gate snapped shut tightly behind them, and the suffocating, chaotic blindness of the dead zone vanished instantly. What replaced it struck Zarn with a psychological blow so severe his twin hearts almost completely stopped. He stood paralyzed, his four hands trembling uncontrollably. Every single law of linear physics, the absolute sacred foundation of his highly advanced civilization, shattered into meaningless, primitive dust before his very eyes. The solar system was not gone. It was not a ruined graveyard. It had been systematically weaponized into a breathtaking masterpiece of architectural insanity. Earth, Mars, and Jupiter had not been vaporized by reckless singularity experiments. They were completely encased within a staggering, multi-dimensional ecosystem. Zarn looked upon floating structures that aggressively broke the fundamental rules of geometry. Vast, glowing spheres of contained reality floated effortlessly in the void. Their outer exterior surfaces appeared no larger than a standard, unremarkable moon. Yet, looking through the translucent, shimmering membranes of these pocket dimensions, Zarn could clearly see lush continents, deep blue oceans, and sprawling, luminous cityscapes. These internal worlds possessed surface areas thousands of times larger than their exterior shells. The inside was infinitely larger than the outside. It was a physical paradox, engineered into absolute, flawless perfection. Connecting these floating impossibilities were majestic, sweeping bridges forged entirely of hardened light and heavily compressed gravity. Trillions of tons of industrial cargo and millions of sleek civilian transports zipped along these glowing ribbons of compressed space, moving at fractions of a second. This was absolutely not a desperate species hiding in fear of the dark. This was a wildly thriving, explosive civilization of over 100 billion humans, living comfortably and lavishly in the invisible, warm folds of reality. Before Zarn could even begin to comprehend the sheer, terrifying scale of the blasphemy, his failing scout ship was seamlessly swallowed by a cavernous docking bay located at the extreme edge of a massive, rotating fractal construct. Heavily armed human guards did not swarm the vessel to arrest him. They simply popped open his burning, jammed airlock, politely offered him a cold bottle of purified water, and gently guided the trembling alien commander through a series of instant teleportation corridors. Zarn suddenly found himself standing in a breathtaking, remarkably quiet observation lounge overlooking the extreme edge of the system. The interior walls were warmly lined with ancient, physical paper books and plush leather chairs. Standing casually by a colossal, floor-to-ceiling viewing window was a lone human. Zarn recognized him instantly, even though the biological reality defied linear reason. It was Drew Brown. The man looked older, carrying the dignified, quiet weight of over 130 years. Yet he moved with the effortless, fluid grace of a much younger being. Zarn dropped heavily to his knees. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the human achievement crushed his lifelong, culturally ingrained superiority complex into absolute nothingness. But the creeping terror of the impending cosmic doom snapped his brilliant mind back to the immediate crisis. "You must evacuate," Zarn gasped, his voice breaking as he pointed a shaking, clawed appendage toward the dark, endless void beyond the massive window. "Your engineering is a supreme miracle, human. You have fully conquered the quantum realm, but it will not save you. The null wave is right behind me. It is an unstoppable, violent cosmic apocalypse. It is deleting the entire galaxy right now. You must use these spatial gates to flee immediately. If that wave hits your system, all of this glorious architecture will be completely erased from time." Drew Brown turned slowly away from the window. He looked down at the kneeling, terrified alien commander and did something that chilled Zarn straight to the bone. Drew laughed. It was a rich, warm, genuine sound of amusement. He walked over to a small, polished wooden table, picked up a steaming ceramic mug, and gestured casually toward the massive glass pane. "Stand up, Commander Zarn," Drew said kindly, his tone completely devoid of panic. "Come over here and take a look. You are just in time for the evening harvest." Zarn forced his trembling legs to support his weight. He stumbled blindly to the thick glass, fully expecting to see the ravenous, screaming wall of dark energy crashing down upon them, obliterating the light forever. The null wave was indeed there. It completely filled the entire visual spectrum, a howling, raging tsunami of absolute destruction, rushing directly toward the human border at impossible, terrifying speeds. But as the catastrophic wave struck the outermost perimeter of the solar system, it did not annihilate the pocket dimensions. It did not erase a single inch of reality. Instead, invisible magnetic fields, impossibly vast and unfathomably powerful, flared brilliantly to life. The raging, apocalyptic storm hit a solid wall of human engineering and immediately shattered. The singular, world-ending wave was brutally and systematically sliced into millions of highly controlled, perfectly parallel streams, like raging floodwaters being forcefully redirected into a colossal hydroelectric dam. The terrifying dark energy became completely docile. The streams of destructive force were funneled directly into the massive, gaping mouths of rotating quantum turbines stationed along the edge of the quarantine zone. Each turbine possessed the physical mass of a small planet. The glowing energy grid of the human empire flared with brilliant, blinding intensity as it drank the cosmic apocalypse dry. Zarn collapsed back against the wall, sliding slowly to the floor. His highly advanced brain completely refused to process the incoming data. "What is this?" Zarn whispered in sheer, unadulterated horror. "How can you tame the end of the universe?" Drew took a slow sip from his mug and smiled broadly. "That is the funny thing about linear physics, Commander. You only look at what is right in front of your face. You look at the null wave and see a terrifying cosmic monster. You see an unstoppable natural disaster." Drew leaned down, his sharp eyes locking onto the broken alien. "The null wave is not a natural disaster. We created it." Zarn gasped loudly, his respiratory gills flaring in absolute shock. "For over 100 years, Drew continued, his voice calm and entirely matter-of-fact, we have been aggressively bending, folding, and hollowing out the space inside this system. When you fold reality that densely, you create a massive, undeniable pressure differential. We effectively built a vacuum cleaner on a cosmic scale. All we did was turn the machine on, that wave destroying your mighty empire. That is just the atmospheric backlash. It is the energetic trash, the loose dark matter, and the discarded background radiation of the entire galactic arm being violently sucked into our low-pressure zone. The absolute magnitude of the revelation destroyed whatever tiny fragment remained of Zarn's sanity. The mighty, ancient galactic synod was not being destroyed by a random act of cosmic fury. They were being violently swept up because humanity had created a spatial draft. "You did not hide," Zarn muttered, his voice entirely hollow and completely defeated. "Hide," Drew chuckled, walking slowly back to his comfortable chair. "We were permanently quarantined. We had absolutely zero access to outside resources. But a rapidly growing population of over 100 billion people requires a truly ridiculous amount of power to stay comfortable. So, we combined a little bit of risk, a healthy dose of sheer recklessness, and the exact kind of insane imagination your council aggressively outlawed. We turned your linear apocalypse into an infinite, self-sustaining battery." Drew took another highly satisfied sip of his dark coffee. "Do you have any idea how much electricity it takes to run high-definition virtual reality gaming stations, artificial atmospheric heaters, and gravity synthesizers for 100 billion humans? It takes a galaxy worth of power. We were running a little low last week, so thank you for the delivery." With a trembling claw, Commander Zarn activated the emergency three-dimensional communication relay on his wrist console. He bypassed the standard diplomatic channels and forced a direct, unencrypted link to the deepest survival bunker of the Galactic Synod. The air in the quiet, leather-bound observation lounge shimmered as a massive holographic projection flared into existence. The image that materialized was a stark, pathetic contrast to the grand, overbearing displays of power from exactly 100 years ago. The towering figures of the High Council were no longer seated in elevated, glowing thrones. They were huddled together in a dimly lit, failing subterranean chamber. Behind their translucent, flickering forms, the physical walls of their glorious capital world were violently shaking. Dust and debris rained down on their ornate robes as the structural integrity of their reality actively unraveled under the crushing pressure of the energy storm. The High Arbiter, once a terrifying silhouette of absolute judgment, now looked incredibly frail. His chitinous armor was cracked, and his multifaceted eyes darted around in pure, unfiltered panic. When his gaze finally locked onto the relaxed, seated form of Drew Brown, the supreme leader of the galaxy visibly flinched. "Chief Engineer Brown," the High Arbiter rasped, his synthesized voice entirely stripped of its former booming resonance. It was a hollow, desperate wheeze. "We have witnessed the telemetry data. We see your impossible machines consuming the cosmic wave. We beg you. We officially and formally surrender all previous decrees. The Synod was blind. We were foolish to fear your potential." The High Arbiter dropped to his lower knees, a gesture of absolute, humiliating submission broadcast across the failing galactic network. "Please," the alien leader pleaded, his voice breaking. "Extend your energy grid to our core worlds. Shield us. If you save our remaining populations, the Synod will immediately dissolve. We will hand you the supreme seat of the galaxy. Humanity will be granted absolute, unquestioned control over every surviving planet, every starfleet, and every resource in the linear empire. Just share your technology and let us live." Drew Brown did not immediately respond. He slowly set his coffee mug down on the wooden table. He leaned forward in his plush chair and deliberately laced his fingers together. He allowed a heavy, agonizing silence to stretch across the communication link for several long, excruciating moments. The only sound was the distant, muffled explosions of the dying alien capital echoing through the speakers. He let the tension build to an absolute, unbearable peak, forcing the arrogant lords of the cosmos to sweat under the crushing weight of their own impending extinction. Then, Drew shook his head. "I must decline," Drew said softly, his voice carrying the sharp, cold edge of a perfectly swung blade. "We have absolutely zero interest in taking over the leadership of a dilapidated, failing galaxy. You operate on outdated laws and you are chronically terrified of fundamental progress. Furthermore, assuming supreme leadership requires a massive amount of administrative responsibility. And honestly, we prefer our freedom. Keep your throne. The holographic projection plunged into a suffocating, deathly stillness. The High Arbiter slumped backward, his spirit entirely broken. The council members beside him lowered their heads, closing their eyes as the violent shaking of their bunker intensified. They fully believed this was the end. They assumed the final, brutal punishment of the human race was simply watching their former jailers quietly burn to ash. Drew allowed them to wallow in their absolute despair for exactly 10 seconds. With a casual sigh, the human engineer reached down into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a remarkably thick, heavily bound stack of physical paper documents. He tossed the massive file onto the table, the heavy thud echoing sharply across the comms link. It was a deliberate, flawlessly executed mirror of the exact moment he had signed their isolation treaty 1 century prior. However, Drew noted, pushing the thick stack of papers closer to the visual capture lens, our architectural teams recently finished constructing a few spare pocket dimensions on the outer rim of the system. We originally designated them as a cosmic wildlife nature reserve. The climate is quite pleasant, and we even installed specialized artificial gravity dampeners to simulate linear physics for those with weak hearts and fragile constitutions like yourselves. The High Arbiter snapped his head up, confusion and a tiny, desperate spark of hope warring in his compound eyes. You will not be joining human society, Drew clarified smoothly, tapping the cover of the massive document. You are far too rigid to integrate with our multidimensional infrastructure, but you are officially permitted to seek asylum as long-term space tenants of Earth. This is your lease agreement. Rent will be paid strictly in raw, primitive planetary resources delivered on a monthly basis. And most importantly, you will abide absolutely and unquestioningly by the human rulebook while residing in our backyard. Zarn stared at the thick document, realizing with a profound, stinging clarity that his entire mighty civilization had just been officially demoted to the status of exotic zoo animals living in a rented human basement. But looking at the terrifying void outside, it was a humiliating reality they had absolutely no choice but to accept. The High Arbiter wept openly as he frantically signaled his verbal agreement to the humiliating terms. The transmission cut out shortly after, replaced by the chaotic scramble of the entire alien evacuation fleet preparing to launch. Drew Brown stood up from his chair, picking up his ceramic mug one final time. He walked back to the colossal viewing window. Out in the vast, glowing expanse of the engineered solar system, the first wave of battered, terrified alien refugee ships began to limp through the spatial gates. They moved slowly, cautiously, forming a massive, pathetic line as they were herded by human tugboats toward the artificially lit nature reserves. The galaxy had once decided to completely exclude Earth. They had firmly locked the doors and thrown away the key. But as Drew took a long, deeply satisfying sip of his dark coffee, he knew the truth of the new era. Earth was no longer locked out. Earth was the absolute master of the house, holding the master keys to every single door of reality. The universe had tried to bury humanity, but humanity simply smiled, walked away, and accidentally pocketed the entire cosmos. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Z Sci-Fi Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.